All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to the second of our spring College of Public Service Research Brown Bags. It's so nice to see all of you, faculty and students, and thank you for attending. I'm Dr. Streams in the Department of Public Administration, and for today's talk, we will hear from Bachelor of Science in Social Work, and I think I messed up in writing the degree there. I should have put BSSW, so my apologies for that. From Dr. George's Social Welfare Policy course. And I believe this is the second year that we've had students from that class share some of their work with us. And so I know it's going to be fascinating. So I'd like to welcome each of those students. And I will turn it over to Dr. George to explain how it'll work, and then she'll manage the remainder of the session. I will just add that next week, next Friday at the same time at noon Central, we have another, and our last CPS brown bag for the spring will be Dr. Paez in public administration, sharing her research on channeling water conflicts through the legislative branch in Columbia. So I encourage anybody who's able to return for that interesting talk as well. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. George. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Streams, and thank you everyone for coming today to support my students and their beautiful work. This is work that they did during the Social Welfare Policy class, which is Social Work 3400 for any of you students that may be on here. That is when you'll get an opportunity to do this work. But what they do is analyze social movements. The course is about the history of social welfare policy and how we got to where we are, from the dawn of civilization and the River Valley civilizations all the way to current times. And so that's a big scope. But all throughout that, we focus on how groups of people can come together to create change through social movements. And sometimes that's change that is consistent with social work values, and sometimes movements can seek change that are not consistent with social work values. And so it's important for us as social workers to understand how to analyze and break down social movements, so that we can understand what we're up against if they're not pursuing values towards social justice, and then also how we can manage and develop our own social movements to encourage the progress that we want to see. And so in doing this, of course, there are people that spend their entire lives analyzing social movements, very complicated rubrics that could be out there to do that. But we use Blumer's model, which is on my slide here. There we go. And so I just want to take a moment, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to present what these terms are. And then we've got three students that are going to talk about their social movements. We have Kaitlin Hicks that examined the Dreamers Deserve Rights movement. We have Karlin Edwards, who examined the Me Too movement, and Deja Washington, who examined the pro-choice movement. And so they will do individual presentations. And as they do that, you'll hear them use the words from the model, which is emergence, coalescence, bureaucratization, although they may say formalize, because that's a hard word to say, or they might say the B word, right? But bureaucratization, and then decline. And so emergence is as normally it's a time of discontent, where, like, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement really spurred after Trayvon Martin was shot. And right, and then it kind of coalesced as leaders began to emerge, and then it bureaucratized, where they actually filed a 501c3. There's academic literature about Black Lives Matter. There's a formal agenda. There's rights, right? And so there's all of this stuff where they formalize. And then, of course, that movement is not necessarily in decline, but they have been repressed, right? And decline happens in different ways, where movements may be repressed by law enforcement or other policy efforts. They could be co-opted, where other interest groups come in and co-opt the movement and try to twist it and use it for their own agenda. Sometimes social movements decline because they succeed, right? And if they achieve their efforts, then maybe they stop their action, or sometimes they adapt their action and evolve, right? Maybe change their mission. And then some just fail, some because they split off into factions and start forming other movements that move in opposite directions. And then sometimes they encapsulate where the leaders get so insular that no one else can join, right? Which is another way of failure. And then sometimes the ideas that the movement is pushing for become established with the mainstream. And so that's the basic model. The other things that we're going to talk about here, the students also do a zine, right? And so what is a zine? Wait, oh, I'm sharing the wrong screen. And so I'm going to post some zines out into the chat. Now, they are simple. Zines are radical forms of disseminating ideas. They came about when the photocopier was invented, where it became easy to make black and white copies of things. There were a lot of people in the 80s that would get in trouble at work because they were using work photocopiers to make zines, right? Or school photocopiers. But these days you could do it at home pretty easy, or at Kinko's. But it's a way where you can get your ideas out there without a publisher, right? And it doesn't cost a lot of money. And so this is a little how-to, what they look like when they're done, right? They're folded up pieces of paper and they make little booklets, right? They look like that. And so I'm going to be sharing some with you as PDF files. If you so choose, you can make your own zine or you can print them off. But that is a chance for the students to communicate the art of the movement, right? Because social movements aren't all just science. They also are the art of the human spirit, right? Okay, so that is enough from me. And now the format is each student is going to present for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A for the entire panel at once. Up first, we have Ms. Kaitlin Hicks. Are you ready to go?
Yes, Dr. George.
Excellent. Her project is called Dreamers Deserve Rights. Or wait, that's the title of the zine. And then her project is called Dreamers, a Social Movement. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. George. Yes, so I am presenting on Dreamers, a Social Movement. So first thing, what a dreamer is a dreamer is defined as someone who was brought to the United States as a minor and lacks proper documentation. Often these people have grown up in the States, they've gone to school here, they've formed friendships here, they consider it home and identify more with American culture, traditions, and society than that of their birth nation. The Dreamer social movement actually really emerged it's unique in a social movement as a lot of the phases overlap. It emerged with bureaucratization in the early 2000s. There were two things that occurred, one on a federal level and one on a state level. On the state level, the California Assembly Bill 540 was introduced in May of 2001 and was signed into law on October 12, 2001. This allowed undocumented students to attend California universities and pay in-state tuition rates, provided that they graduated from a California university or California high school, as well as met other criteria. On a federal level, the DREAM Act, or Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act, was presented to Congress on August 1st of 2002. This would provide legal status for undocumented youth, allowing them to get jobs, go to universities, and obtain citizenship. However, this did not pass. This was really kind of the beginning of the Dreamer social movement. It's where the movement got its name. It's when this group of people realized that they would really have to step up and fight and do more to obtain their rights. From the early 2000s until 2010, there were 10 variations of the DREAM Act that were presented to Congress that did not pass. So that's 10 years of hard work and hardship that was not given the media attention that it really needed to gain traction. So in 2010, 4 dreamers decided that they were going to change that, and they set out on the Trail of Dreams. This is a 1,500-mile walk from Miami, Florida to Washington, D.C. They started on January 1st and reached DC on May 1st, and they had 2 goals in mind. The first goal was to put a face to the immigration debate, to force people to see immigrants as people, to fight anti-immigration rhetoric and negative stereotypes put forth by the mainstream media. Their second goal was to put pressure on the federal government to acknowledge and fix the broken systems and immigration laws that were in place in her immigrant families. They even requested an audience with President Obama, which was granted only to Juan Rodriguez, in which he expressed their goals and what they wanted to do and what they would like to see the White House do for them. It would be another 2 years after this before President Obama would sign Daca into law on June 15th of 2012. Daca stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and what it does is it provides social security numbers to undocumented immigrants qualifying as dreamers. This would allow them to apply for jobs and go to college and plan to provide a simple path to citizenship. However, it is only good for 2 years. So every 2 years, DACA recipients have to reapply and request that they be renewed that status and protection from deportation. Like any social movement, the Dreamers movement has been met with a lot of opposition. Specifically, the Trail of Dreams, as they were walking, they were met with threats and protests. And these were teenagers who were met with threats and protests. Even the KKK planned their route and met them on it. There's a lot of raids by ICE, which can be terrifying. And a lot of immigrants, when they are in ICE custody, do not have access to proper and fair legal representation that they need to plead their cases. The Trump administration also put a lot of anti-immigration laws in place, such as travel ban. And in 2017, President Trump rescinded DACA, which suddenly left a lot of DACA recipients unprotected, no longer able to hold their jobs, no longer able to go to school, and they did not have that protection that they previously had. Despite all of this, the social movement continued to gain traction and gain leaders and key figures. One of the most notable key figures in the Dreamers movement is Jose Antonio Vargas. He is a dreamer who immigrated from the Philippines as a child. He's a journalist, filmmaker, and author of Define America, or Dear America. And I would highly recommend that book. It's very good. One of the things that he did that gained the most attention for the movement was in 2012, he wrote a Time article called Not Legal, Not Leaving. And he gathered other dreamers who were comfortable sharing their stories, and they were put on the cover of Time magazine. The purpose was to force people to examine the realities that dreamers face and the part that every single person may play in the reality of their lives. The phases overlap. Bureaucratization really is what helped it emerge. And once the DREAM Act spurred that and they gained key figures, separate from politicians and lawmakers, dreamers have organized and propelled the movement unlike any immigration support and reform before them. They've organized, they've supported each other almost exclusively on social media. The Trail of Dreams gained traction and attention through their social media documentation, and they found support for each other. It never has been, nor is it yet, danger-free for undocumented immigrants to speak up for themselves and their rights. And living in a society that frequently tells them that they don't belong here, that they haven't earned it, is terrifying and isolators, and yet they've been able to use social media to form and unify and revolutionize immigration movements. There are several organizations that work within the Dreamers movement, and three of the more well-known notable ones are United We Dream, Define America, and FWD. United We Dream has over 400,000 members in over 100 local groups throughout the nation. What's one of the largest youth-led movements in the United States, and it focuses on empowering and educating dreamers about their rights and what they can do to obtain citizenship and receive protection. And this organization itself was founded exclusively using social media, which is one of the things that sets it apart and makes it unique from other social movements. Define America was founded by Jose Antonio Vargas and other immigrants within the entertainment industry. They work to combat negative stereotypes about undocumented immigrants in entertainment. They educate and consult in the entertainment industry, working with directors, producers, writers, and authors. Most notably, they've consulted on Grey's Anatomy and with Superstore. So if you watch Superstore, the character Mateo was really created by Define America. FWD is made of businesswomen and men who just have a lot of wealth and decided that they wanted to do something with it. People like Mark Zuckerberg, Reed Hastings, who's the CEO of Netflix, the CEO of Yahoo, Marissa Mayer, are all part of this organization. They focus on immigration and criminal justice reform, partnering with politicians, lawmakers, and lawyers to create policy, lobby to politicians, as well as provide legal representation for immigrants that may need it. Under the Biden administration, he has reversed some of Trump's immigration restrictions, such as the travel ban. He signed an executive order, and with that executive order, it just was a promise saying that he will preserve and fortify DACA, as well as he has promised to propose a new immigration bill. That has not been passed yet, but those are things that the Biden administration says that they are working on. The Dreamer social movement has not yet reached its decline in any form. It's still young, it's still thriving. There have been failures, there have been successes, just like with any movement, and it's just beginning, and it is still moving forward with power, purpose, and hope, and the hope that it will continue to reach success. So there's my cited. Thank you so much for your time. Stop sharing the screen.
As a professor, I got to say, I love that long works cited page. Excellent work, Kaitlin. Let's move right on into Karlin, and I'm going to go ahead. Caitlin's zine is in the chat. I am going to go ahead and put Karlin's in here now as well, and then there's also the how-to in there. And then I am going to share Karlin's screen. Our internet provider is failing her today.
Yeah. We just moved, so this is a new internet provider for us.
Excellent. Oh, wait, I forgot to hit share screen. So a lot more to manage than just writing things on a blackboard. All right, I'm going to mute and turn it over to you, Karlin.
Okay. All right, so I did my movement onto the Me Too movement. So Me Too was founded by, sorry for my voice as well, I've been allergies, was founded by Tarana Burke. She's an activist and a community organizer and executive. Professor George, are you able to go to the next slide? Thank you. Whenever the Me Too movement hashtag was made, it had been used more than 19 million times on Twitter alone. She encountered a woman at a youth camp who had a big impact on her. She held a bonding session at the camp when the young woman asked to speak to Burke privately about experiencing sexual abuse. This became the foundation of the Me Too movement. And can you move to the next? Thank you. So the meaning of the Me Too movement was to focus on the experiences of sexual violence survivors. It is an effort to effect social change, primarily organized through social media. It provided a source of solidarity for women from all backgrounds who experience sexual harassment, most often, but not limited to male colleagues. And then the emergent state for this was when Harvey Weinstein cases started to surface. He's a very known, powerful film producer. Alyssa Milano, she was an actress under the control of Harvey. She first voiced her sexual harassment is when that movement really took off. She tweeted, "If you've ever been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too" as a reply to this tweet. In 24 hours, it was shared more than 12 million times. And then Rose McGowan then spoke up about her sexual abuse, and she was even locked out of Twitter and blocked for voicing her dark truth. Other allegations started to surface against Bill Cosby, Fox News chief Rogers, and Donald Trump. And then moving to the Colton, this is when the Me Too movement held a huge march, which had thousands of women and even men in LA on November 12th in 2017. The march started in the heart of Hollywood and proceeded for a mile to the corner of Sunset Boulevard, where a podium was set in place for the rally of speeches. There's a couple chants that I thought were really clever that was ran through these marches. Two of them were "Not in pots, not in plants, keep your junk inside your pants." Another big one was "Harvey Weinstein is a joke, women just got woke." On January 20th, 2018, the day of Trump's inauguration, millions of people came together to protest and show support for the growing movement against sexual abuse. This was also a protest against Trump's inauguration as president. Millions of women all over came together for this. Really a great way to say hi to him, right? To top this march off, it was the anniversary of the Women's March protest, which has helped the Me Too movement. So on top of his inauguration, this was the big anniversary of the Women's March protest. So not a good day for him. And then our fifth slide is the formalization. This movement has reached nearly every region of the world, viral through all social media platforms. Influences can be measured in courts and changing legislation, and predominantly even in the growing backlash when people think the movement has gone too far. I don't want to butcher her name. She's a law student in Pakistan, Kajit. She was stabbed 23 times by a male classmate after she advanced in school when he did not. Being in Pakistan, this was a huge issue for men, seeing women succeed. So he almost got to walk because of this. She did not stay silent. More than 2 million supporters stood by her to be sure she got the justice she deserved. Even though it took her 2 years to this appeal, she was able to have victory for not just her, but millions of women in Pakistan. This was a huge step, and this kind of resulted into the Me Too movement as well over there, because women were not treated as an equal at all in that area. And decline state of this movement, it was very successful. It went beyond one country and was recognized in many different areas of our world. It's still a very active movement today. There's still many movies being made on this movement. Even since COVID, more and more women and men are coming out with their sexual abuse stories. There has been, I'm in the music scene a lot, and there has been many allegations against many DJs since COVID. I think this has really helped women actually express, and men express what's been going on in their lives. Books and films have been made. She Said, published by Kanto and Chwani, has been a really big hit. There could be work done in the area, not work done as in not just old men sexually abusing younger white women. Latinos, gay women and men and Black men are most likely to be sexually harassed at work versus white women. And there we go. And then my last slide, I made a little collage of all the protests and everything like that.
Excellent. Great work, Karlin. Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Deja Washington, who examined the pro-choice movement. And her zine is titled Abortion is Freedom, and I'm going to be putting that in the chat. And then I will turn this over to you, Daijah. Are you ready?
I am. Give me a second so that I can share my screen. Okay. All right. So I did my project on the pro-choice movement. So what is pro-choice? Depending on who you ask will determine the answer to that question. So the pro-choice movement is a social movement that fights for the basic human right to decide when and whether to have children. Pro-choice is the ability to choose the option for an unplanned pregnancy to be terminated. Supporting the pro-choice movement is an individual stating that even if they would not choose abortion for themselves, to still allow a woman to make that decision. Emergence. So to understand the pro-choice movement, you must understand why it began. Margaret Sanger, which she was a birth control activist who fought for the rights of women to be able to take contraceptives to prevent childbirth. She also opened the first birth control clinic in 1916. The goal of Margaret Sanger was to prevent women from having babies that were unplanned, fatal birth defects, and pregnancies that would result in the death of the mother. In 1921, Sanger founded the American Birth Control League, which would later evolve into Planned Parenthood Federation of America. This laid the foundation for women's rights and their pro-choice decision-making. In 1964, Pat McGinnis, Lena Khan, and Rowena Gurner, known as the Army of Three, joined to form the pro-choice movement to repeal active abortion laws. 4 years later, they formed NARAL, which is the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. The NARAL was an association with the pro-choice movement, and they fought for national abortion rights for all women. Coalescence. In 1985, the NARAL launches its first national campaign using the slogan "Abortion Rights, Silent No More." This campaign consisted of women and women protesting women's voices and their stories about their experiences with choosing abortion. This campaign grew into their first political effort. At this campaign, there were 40,000 letters written by women across the nation that were read. In 1989, the NARAL co-sponsored the March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C. This march brings together a record-breaking crowd. They also protested restrictive and anti-choice laws that were being put in place by current leaders of the government. So the NARAL was really busy. The women of the NARAL were really busy, and they had a large following. The pro-choice movement continued to fight for reproductive freedom of women at the federal and national level. This organization is recognized by our nation's leaders. The recognition is not always positive, depending on who is leading the nation in that time. National recognition caused the nation's leaders to interfere throughout the movement, and this was based on what the current leaders of the government felt was best for the nation. Bureaucratization, the recognition by government officials regarding the pro-choice movement grew quickly. So the pro-choice movement was recognized on a national level due to the lawmakers wanting to have full input on what women were doing with their reproductive organs. Most of these lawmakers were men. In 1973, a Supreme Court case, Roe versus Wade, was the landmark decision that affirmed abortion as a constitutional right. This was a win for the pro-choice movement, but it was granted by the Supreme Court. Years later, a new president was inaugurated. Positive changes began to happen for the NARAL. In 1993, President Bill Clinton ordered a reversal of 5 of the discriminatory abortion restrictions that had been put in place by the previous presidents. President Bill Clinton also signed into effect the Family and Medical Leave Act. This allotted men and women to have time to recover away from their job after childbirth. The decline of the pro-choice movement it's a lifelong journey and battle. The fight for women's reproductive rights could continue into the next century. The pro-choice movement has made many differences in establishing new rights and overturning some of the previous laws. This movement can also seem as if it could be a losing battle, since the lawmakers and leaders in the positions of power have the choice whether to ban or support women's reproductive rights. Most of the leaders in power that are in control of this are Caucasian men. Men do not have childbearing organs and should not be allowed to tell women what to do with such. So the pro-choice movement is an ongoing movement and has more in store for a bright future as long as our nation's leaders understand that banning abortion is a direct violation of the basic human rights that are listed in the United States Constitution. The pro-choice movement is directly related to social injustice. Social workers fight daily for meaningful participation in decision-making for the vulnerable population of people. There are several social injustices that exist within our nation. The right to have an abortion as needed is a human right that is given to women. Banning abortions and that right to make their choice creates a problem that social workers challenge. Social workers challenge social injustices. As a social worker, we must pursue change, specifically with the vulnerable population of people. Women are a vulnerable population of people. Social workers must continue to strive to create opportunities and fight for the equal opportunity that should be afforded to all people. And that is it. I am done.
Don't sound so excited, Daijah. Good job. I know that could be nerve-wracking. And I will just say thank you. I appreciate the work of all of you students and all of my students, even that couldn't present today, for digging deep into these very complicated movements, right? These are not light topics. So let's take some questions. Who has some questions or comments for our presenters?
I don't have any questions, but I just continue to be amazed by what the students in your classes are learning. I absolutely loved it last year, and I love it even more this year. You guys have done an amazing job in analyzing these movements, and I just wanted to say that for the record. I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to say how impressed I am with your work.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Dr. Winters. I'm proud of them too. Sometimes I'm surprised and shocked at what I get out of them. And I know that they could do it, but getting it done during a pandemic is a whole other thing. And I am so proud of them all.
I was in a training workshop earlier this morning, and I saw another faculty member teaching she's in history. And one of the assignments that she showed, we were talking about assignments, but it was, she teaches post-World War history, World War II. And it was about taking a social movement from the 60s or 70s that the students have studied, and then choosing a song, and she would give them some examples of songs from that era and connecting it to the social movement. And there was more to the assignment, but when you said, Dr. George, at the beginning, you said something like, when you talk about the zines, that social movements themselves are a kind of art of the human spirit or something like that. And I must admit, I never thought of them that way. But when, after just seeing that assignment and looking at those lists of songs and how powerful they each were in different movements, I'm Coming Out, Strange Fruit, just different, epochal songs for different rights movements. I was wondering, students, as you studied your movement, were there really notable pieces of art, whether it was movies or songs or anything that you came across that connected, that was a focal point or a piece of the movement?
I
Yeah,
think
for
for
me, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no,
Sorry.
sorry, you're good. I think for mine it was honestly, since even with COVID, since Netflix and Hulu became a huge thing, there has been a lot of movies that have come out with the Me Too movement. Don't know if y'all have watched it on Netflix, but Moxie, she actually was a whole line girl in high school, and I outed myself because I knew what she was doing. I was like, oh my god, I made one of those. But if you haven't watched Moxie, watch it. It is a great movie on Netflix, and it's a whole about a social movement. It's about feminists, women's rights. So it's really good. Just really happy knew exactly what was going on. I was like, this is great. This is awesome that people are being more aware of the situations and people are being more proactive about these things.
Daijah, what did you have to say?
Yeah, I was gonna say Beyonce has a song, is Who Run the World Girls. And I watched an interview on that, and she basically wrote that song to, like, she said that the reason for writing that song was more so to stand up to men, and men who degrade women or who downplay women or their rights and things like that. So I felt like that would like directly relate to my presentation.
I'll say that movements are about emotions, and people don't really accomplish much without some kind of fire in the belly. And that fire in the belly comes from emotion and nostalgia too. And music is very important with that, in art. And I actually think that adding the zine kind of helps students learn because as they're reviewing the content for their paper, they're also looking for things that can be artistic, right? And so they're sourcing those things to put in their zines as well. I am going to go ahead and here in a minute, when somebody else starts talking, I'm going to dump some zines from the other students that are listed on the agenda that weren't able to do a presentation, but you can still see their zines. Who else has some questions?
Yeah, I have a question regarding dreamers. I think there's a difference between dreamers and those under the Daca protection program. And first of all, what are the steps, or are there prospects for dreamers to be covered by Daca? And also under the Biden administration, what are the prospects for those under the Daca protection to finally get maybe permanent status?
Yeah, so DACA is for people who arrived as minors, which is what the Dreamer social movement is about. So I would say DACA covers the Dreamer social movement as far as people who qualify. And then the Biden administration, what they've discussed doing is expanding DACA, because right now it's only 2 years. And so they've discussed expanding it to cover you until you obtain citizenship. So to cover someone who receives DACA for an indefinite amount of time, and make that path easier, and not, because with DACA, the path to citizenship is supposed to be easier, but then every 2 years, everything's suddenly uncertain again. And while I'm on my path to citizenship, but also now, I'm not protected anymore. And so with DACA, what the Biden administration has discussed doing is expanding it so that you don't have that uncertainty every 2 years, and you don't have to prove that you deserve this protection or that you qualify for this protection every 2 years, and to just make it an indefinite coverage so that you're always covered until you achieve citizenship.
Got a question, but first of all, I want to say all three presentations were really well done and really interesting. So I'm wondering, each of your perspectives, there's lots of injustices and there's lots of things that people are passionate about changing, but there's much fewer number of things that become an actual movement. Can you pinpoint anything that you saw as you studied this phenomenon? Like, what makes something become a movement versus just a little pet project or something that fizzles out?
I think personally, or my opinion, I think dedication and consistency. A lot of things I just in general, people start and they don't finish just because I feel like that they fail. So eventually they give up on whatever movement it is that they're pursuing. But if you're really dedicated and you're really passionate about it and you're consistent with that dedication and that passion, and you just continue and you continue, people fall in line. They hear you and they begin to understand, and they just kind of follow suit.
Also to add to that, I think a lot of hurt happens for movements. A lot of tired of feeling like nobody's listening. I think anger, hurt, I think those things, a lot of those things happen when it happens.
Also to add, like, I'll use, for example, like abuse victims sometimes, like rape or something like that. It's always that one person that'll come out or say, hey, I was abused by this person. And then that gives everybody else the courage to kind of speak up and say, hey, it happened to me too. So they don't fear. I think it's lack of fear. You begin to not fear anymore. And then they see, you always have that one leader. And then again, like everybody else just kind of falls in line and like, okay, you know what? She had the power, or he had the power to kind of stand up. So let me try to.
Thank you.
And I'll also add that according to Blumer's model, then it's those stages. And you may have some things that emerge, but they never really coalesce, right? Or meaning that people don't really come around the idea. Or then you may have people come around an idea like Occupy Wall Street, right? A lot of people came out around that idea, but it didn't necessarily bureaucratize. And so it didn't formalize those structures or that agenda. It kind of split off into these different factions, right? And so Blumer would argue that social movements are a constant, that anytime anybody has an idea, essentially it's the potential for a social movement. And it's about whether or not there's that emergent point, which does normally come from pain. Right, and then people that relate to that begin to coalesce around it. And the term relative deprivation, right? And of course, as social workers, we think about like the Black Panther movement that formed because they felt they were being deprived of things that other people had, right? Namely white people, which I agree was true. But then you also have to think about the alt-right, right? And that movement and how that has emerged and coalesced, kind of, or re-emerged, because they too feel relatively deprived, right? And they feel that Jews are going to replace them or some other group is going to replace them. And so you've got to remember that just because it's a social movement and they believe they're seeking social justice doesn't always mean that they're seeking social justice from the social worker's perspective, if that makes sense. Dr. Sequat, did you have something, another comment? Oh, sorry, Butler.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the Black Lives Matter movement. Does that meet the requirements of the model? That
Absolutely. And in
presented?
the course, we use that as an example that we all analyze as a class together. But then students, I allow them to pull off a certain part of it, like the take a knee movement, or the say her name movement, right? But the whole Black Lives Matter movement we use as an example. And we always talk about how the history of that really comes from the Black Panther movement or the Black consciousness movement, or, that goes, these have roots way back in history. And then they may reemerge with a different sort of group, a different emergent point, a different group of people coalescing around them. And then we discuss in class as to whether or not Black Lives Matter started with Rodney King, and him being beaten when cameras were first able to record that, versus did it start with Trayvon Martin, and which one was the true emergent point. And I just say, I don't care. It's the third wave of the civil rights movement, right? That's the bigger movement that I feel like Rodney King kicked off.
I want to make a statement. I think each one of you did an excellent job in presenting your points. Your points were very well expressed, and you did those well. Well, for every point, there is a counterpoint. And I wanted to make sure, especially if you all are going forward and making these presentations other places, at other venues, that you are aware of the counterpoints of your social movement, because there's some challenges out there for each one of those movements. I'm not going to ask you to state those right now, but I just want each one of you to, if you know what your counterpoints are. If you want to state a couple, you can, but I want to make sure that you know that, because there's another side to each one of those.
Are you speaking as like, what are the difficulties with the movement as like the Me Too movement? It'd be, we've had people say that they've gone too far. They're,
any of those
girl gang
that,
things.
that would be one, but any of those counterpoints. The Me Too movement is not so well. Okay, yeah, that would be one. Some of the others. Why didn't you all speak up 20 years ago? Why is it taking 20 years? All of those kinds of things be ready to address with that. So every one of those movements that's been presented today, you got to be ready to address some of those counterpoints or those attacks that's going to come.
I just follow up a little bit on Professor Butler's point, because I'm curious whether Blumer's model addresses the issue of framing, like how are social problems framed in the language that's used around them, and then what the impact of the framing is on the emergence or the success of the movement. Because I think that's one of the challenges, for example, with the pro-choice movement. I have seen some framings more recently. There's a bulletin board, or what do you call it? Yeah, bulletin, not a bulletin board, but those big billboard. Can see I don't get out anymore now. The last year, but there is a billboard on Gallatin Road down by not that far from the downtown campus, and it had a line on it, something like "abortion is freedom" or something like that, in imagery of young women. And it was some local organization had took out this billboard, but in a place that has high religiosity, that kind of framing is going to be really a hard sell, I think. And I have a former doctoral student who works in global health, and I've talked to her. She informed me about the way in public health overseas and global health spending overseas and stuff, where wealthy countries donate money and give money to other countries for programs. They've stopped using any wording like that, and they reframe, if they ever did, but they don't even use the word abortion. They'll use the word healthy timing and healthy timing and family size. And so changing the framing to something that might be a little more palatable, or an idea that somebody could come around who is very family and child oriented, and maybe has might have religiosity affecting how they're seeing things, that the abortion is freedom framing can work very well with some target audiences, but may not work well with other target audiences. So I'm just curious about how framing of concepts fits into his model, Blumer's model, or if it doesn't really address that.
That one's advanced for students, but do any of my students have anything they want to say to that point before I take that?
think
Okay, go
I
ahead.
think maybe if it does, I think that kind of aligns with the decline of the social movement. And the reason why I say that is because the success or the failure of the movement, how the movement evolves, or how the movement transpires over time, and where the movement actually goes. So I think that if it does fit anywhere in that Blumer's model, it would definitely probably be somewhere in the decline of the movement.
You are so right, Daijah, and I'm so proud of you. And that is how Blumer's model deals with those counterpoints, right? He would view them as either an attempt at repression, an attempt at co-optation, or if it's coming from within the movement, it would be because their ideas have split into factions or have become too encapsulated and they're not listening to other people. So the accusation that Me Too has gone too far would be like they have become too encapsulated and are no longer listening to men, right? And that like call out culture, they have changed that term from where it's not call out, now it's cancel culture. And that is co-optation, where call out culture grows from the Me Too movement and someone that has held in their pain for so long that they finally come out and will call out their perpetrators, right, or the people that hurt them. And that has been equated with cancel culture, where on the social media of just saying, oh, well, Bill Cosby's a rapist, so he's canceled, or, whoever has done this, so they're canceled. And that in some ways has co-opted it. But yes, and so it is in the model, but super complicated. And I'll also add that there are people that do linguistic research to look at how people respond to certain terms. And they will do regional research to determine should they call it abortion or should they call it family planning. And there are differences. I'm not sure of all that data, but I do know that there are differences in terms of who's going to receive what word. But that is an advanced social movement that has technical expertise, that has someone that can direct that level of research. And it is happening around, I'm sure that it's happening around pro-life and pro-choice research.
I have a question. I think it kind of goes with what a comment Dr. Streams made, or maybe it's just a general question for you doctors on here. When you alter the language of a movement, or you change the way the language of a movement is worded to appeal to a different crowd, or appeal to, is that not settling? Do you consider that settling, or is that like demeaning to the movement? Or, I mean, I just want to make sure I'm looking at it, because that's the way I look at it. I look at altering the language of a movement, something that you're passionate about, to appeal to a separate group, is settling in a way. So yeah, I guess that's my question. Is that true?
I think that's a really interesting point. When I approach it, I'm thinking in terms of people that want to achieve policy change. And to achieve policy change, ultimately, unless you actually overthrow the society and start again, then you're trying to influence the people that make the laws in many cases. I'm not saying laws are the only way social change occurs, but you're often trying to influence the people who make the laws. Now, of course, you're also trying at the same time to influence who gets in a position of power to make laws. So that's another aspect, right? But until you get so many people that already have your viewpoint to be in the position of power that you have the majority, and you could just vote with the exact language and changes that you you know, that are the core beliefs of the movement, then then you may have a social movement, but you won't get the legal change that you want. And so you're right. I think that it can be seen as settling. And part of the challenge is, and I am not expert in this, but I do focus on the policy change side. Okay. I'm not expert in the sociology of social movements, which is, you know, part of that. However, I would say the language that attracts people to fight for the movement isn't always the same language that gets other people who don't already agree with it to vote in favor of policy change that helps the movement's goals. So is that settling, or is that savvy use of the system that you're part of? Right? If you don't have the power to overthrow the system, are you trying to affect change within the system? And then which is more important, exact terminology or getting the policy change that you want? So
I just want to jump in and piggyback on that, because even outside of policy, I don't think it's either or. I think it works hand in hand, because you're always going to have people who are at the forefront, very passionate, and you're going to have people at the other extreme that are pushing back against the issue. And most people are going to be in the middle just because they don't have the knowledge yet, or haven't immersed themselves in it, or haven't been exposed to it. So you have the people leading at the front who has, I think, the language that you are saying, you know, just put it on out there and, you know, be bold, be clear. But then you can also have people who are, you know, you can look at it as compromising, but are making it more palatable to like the general mass, and that pulls people along a little bit, so that maybe the whole spectrum shifts a little bit. So you don't need to substitute the passionate people who are going to tell it like it is in blunt terms, but you also need those middle people who can kind of move the movement forward some, and then you can move them a little bit farther, and then a little bit farther, hopefully, you know, for the good direction, you know, from the social work point of view. But you know, I think that's how all movements work. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a hand in hand, like you're saying, whether it's policy or just public backing and public awareness and education.
And sometimes you just code switch where you say one
Right, that's
thing.
what I was going to say.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
let me go, Dean Williams.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So it's really about code switching, that as long as you are focused on and clear about what the goals are of the movement and what you are trying to achieve, sometimes you have to speak a different language depending on the audience that you're speaking to. You're saying the same thing with the intent of achieving the same goal, but you're speaking in the language that is appropriate for the audience for whom you are speaking. So just like the same way that when you're in the academy and you're at school, you speak to people in the language and the vernacular of what we speak in an academic setting. When you're with your friends, with your grandmother, you speak to her in a different way. Now, you may be saying the exact same thing, but you are speaking in the language that is relevant for the cultural context and the people for whom you are speaking. So the same thing exists oftentimes with social movements, that you have to be able to code switch. You have to be able to speak the language in the boardroom or in the policymaking room that is appropriate for that particular cultural context. And at the same time, you have to be able to be very clear about what the message is in the streets, because what the message is in the streets, and that you are, as a social worker, as a public health person, as an anthropologist, whomever, you are the bridge, you are the cultural broker. You are speaking the languages and you are creating the connections between those two different domains or those different worlds. So that's kind of how I see it, that it's not about the idea of co-optation or the idea of settling, but it really is about the idea of being savvy enough to be able to use the kind of language that is needed in the spaces and places in which you find yourself, and staying on point to what the message is and what you are trying to achieve.
Well said. And I do understand your point though, Daijah, and like defund the police, right? There are so many people that really mean get rid of the police, right? And in many ways that is a phrase that has been co-opted into mean reorganize the police, right? And what do those two things mean? And are they compatible at all? And you know, and of course, as social workers, we are constantly working with governments and bureaucracy. And so we are in many ways translators, like Dean Williams was saying, between like totally defunding the police isn't a reality for this generation, right? And honestly, it would put us into a place where only wealthy people could afford private security, which, you know, in some ways could put poor people in a more vulnerable position. And so in some ways, as professionals, we have to sometimes help those social movement groups that are coming from raw anger and nobody ever taught them Blumer's model or to think about social movements and how complicated they can be. And you have to kind of, even though you may side with the people, right, you still have to recognize that they're not going to get what they want overnight. And so you do have to apply those professional skills, and it's called incremental change. And, you know, and where you do, I mean, I would love to snap my fingers and make everything perfect, but there's never a social movement that's ever been able to do that. This is a movement, not a moment, right? And so you do have to make sure that you're appreciating that those movers that came before you, right? And everybody that's going to carry it forward. We are coming close to the end of time. Who else has comments or questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question. I also want to say to Ms. Hicks, Ms. Washington, and Ms. Edwards, you did a phenomenal job. So just know that going in. My question is that generally social movements as cultural phenomenon, they oftentimes borrow from each other, whether that's in terms of strategies, as well as in terms of sort of theories or goals or perspectives. And I was just wondering, with respect to the social movements that you all analyzed, did you all see any borrowing of strategies or approaches from other social movements and or sort of learnings? And I kind of give you an example. So the Black Lives Matter movement is really part of a long-standing tradition of the civil rights movement. And so one of the things that Black Lives Matter advocates realized was that with the civil rights movement, that having a single leader at the head oftentimes is a threat, because if that particular leader who's at the top is taken out, then the movement can be dismantled or dissipated. So Black Lives Matter was really intentional about having multiple leaders, not one single leader. And so I'm just wondering, they learned and borrowed from that movement to be able to move forward. And so I'm just wondering, did you see that with either Me Too or with the Dreamers movement, as well as the pro-life movement, a borrowing or a continuation from earlier movements that these particular movements have drawn from?
I think the Me Too movement does borrow a lot from like a women's rights. That movement, when it hit surface, I think women's rights go with the Me Too movement. I also think it goes with the pro-choice as well. I think that definitely started a big and all that.
There's also the rape crisis movement that really started with Sojourner Truth that ultimately informed Tarana Burke with Me Too.
I would say I think the Dreamers movement definitely pulled a lot even from civil rights, and just the realization of like, oh no, like we belong to this movement as well. And like just that recognition of everything that the civil rights movement had done kind of paved the way for Dreamers to even attach themselves to that movement, or become a sub movement, I guess would probably be more accurate. And then social media, I think, not that social media itself is a social movement, but I think every single movement that uses social media to propel itself kind of learned from the movement that may have started using social media just a little bit before and what worked and what didn't, and things like that.
With mine, I kind of mentioned it just a little bit in my presentation. So the NARAL, which started with Margaret Sanger back in the early 1900s, kind of began that movement, which evolved into the pro-choice movement.
That right to contraception, right? And if you can't get a right to contraception, how in the world are you going to have a right to abortion?
Yeah, and that whole Club Women's movement. Yeah, and the whole Club Women's movement of the early 1900s of women organizing, you know, sort of kind of taking over their rights and being empowered, and the idea of being able to make choices and decisions. So yeah, so I'm glad to see that you all see that there's sort of a historical kind of streams of thought and consciousness that underlie the current movements that we see. And likewise, I think will inform the movements as they continue to go forward. So yeah, so good job.
That is the introduction paragraph of their paper. It's historical connections. And I will say that next Friday, this group is also going to be presenting at the University of Memphis Social Work Symposium. which I'm excited about. That is an external presentation, so we're going to take our work there. And I also, Dr. Streams, were you going to conclude, or did you have another question?
I just wanted to say one last little thing following up on both of what was just said, is that one of the complicating things is the longer that a movement is around, the easier it is to go back to its inception, not only in an honoring kind of way, but also people will start to pick it apart, right? And so, for example, Margaret Sanger also kind of believed in eugenics, which almost all the white intellectuals of the late 1800s and early 1900s believed in eugenics, which is a horrifying realization. And you always have to watch out for anybody from that era. If you go back, you could probably find them saying something about, wouldn't it be better if poor people had fewer children? And wouldn't it be better if Black and brown people, whatever language they used at that point, what if they would have less children? And then you're like, oh my gosh, everything that comes from this is now fruit of a poison tree. And so that is something that you almost, I think, have to be ready for. And because even today, the people who are the founders of the great movements that are going to become great in the future is going to look back at them and find they had feet of clay, so to speak. That's what is the old expression. And so that's another piece of making sure that your movement doesn't rely on an individual, and also to recognize that movements can be bigger and better, and ideas can be bigger and better than the people that had them in the first place. And that's something that I've struggled with, the realization as I got older. Like, you first encounter them and you make heroes out of people, and then time goes on, and just like parents, you realize, oh my gosh, they're just humans and they weren't perfect, right? But the ideas that humans have can be bigger than the humans that have the idea. And if you can just keep your mind on that, the inevitable realization that some of these people, in fact, none of them were perfect, said everything perfect, did everything perfect, won't throw you so much and allow you to be deterred from the goals that the social movement is meant to achieve.
Yes, evolution, right? Social Darwinism. Ultimately, those are the ideas, students, right? That connect to those ideas of those movements are going to change. And people aren't perfect. Every single one of us is flawed. We're going to screw up. We're going to have bad ideas. We're going to mess things up. And that's why groups are so important. That's why the movement is more important, because one person cannot do anything alone. It does take that movement. And out of respect for everybody's time, I'm going to go ahead and call this today. I want to thank everyone again for coming out and joining us and supporting the most excellent work of these fabulous students. Thank you so much for this intellectual discussion and all of your questions. And I look forward to seeing you sometime, or hopefully maybe seeing you in person sometime soon. Congratulations, students. Thank you all very much.